Palantir was the latter, not the former.
Yeah.
It was like we didn't know what we were doing.
Yeah.
The average age of the company was like my age. So I joined when I was, I think, 25. And every year that I was there, it was like the average age was just tracking my age. So it was very young. I don't know if you've seen like the picture of LeBron James breaking the scoring record.
Yes.
And it's like every single person except one dude in the picture had their phone up. And then the Michael Jordan hitting the game-winning shot in the NBA Finals. Everyone was just cheering. They were just looking at it. It's like our whole engagement with humanity has shifted.
If you go back, originally Swords and Shields, if you wanted to actually fight someone and harm them, you had to look them in the eyes and stand up to them toe to toe. We lost some of that with every tech progression, through guns. And then, potentially drones, robots, that's completely gone. The sense that you have to make personal sacrifice or put your own life on the line to actually engage in combat. Is that, you think, just a natural evolution with the tech? That's just how history goes? Do you see other issues arising from that, cost being so present in original combat versus now?
I think we've climbed the curve and we're on our way back down.
Okay.
If you think about like those early days where it's like, conflict was people with fists, and then it was people with rocks, and then it was people with knives made out of rocks, and then it was, metals, and then eventually we got to gunpowder and cannons and trebuchets, catapults. And so you go from like 1-to-1 to like 1-to-some. And then at the peak of this curve was nuclear weapons. Yeah. We got to the point where it was 1-to-many, to the point of like potential destruction of the human race.
Right.
And since then, we haven't been going up. Like we built hydrogen bombs, we built things that had greater, kinetic impact. But really, like the capability was like almost unthinkable, and that's what led to this like period of, long deterrence, which was just rooted in this idea that actually, like, we, humanity, even the bad guys at the time, like, we weren't really all that interested in using nuclear weapons. It was terrifying. And we've been coming back down the curve. You see, like, in the middle stages of the Cold War, we developed precision-guided munitions. So, like, instead of dropping bombs out of airplanes that land on schools, you can shoot a missile through a window. And now we're like getting much more precise. We have better intelligence through the collection assets, new types of sensors. War, in theory, should be getting a lot less dangerous for civilians, for collateral damage, things like that. You look at like drone attacks that have happened very publicly, with taking out leaders of terrorist organizations, whatever. We're using like AIM-9 Ginsu missiles. I don't know if you're familiar with these. They don't even blow up. They just have knives that come out of the side and they spin. And so you can take out a person standing on a roof without damaging the building and without hurting anyone inside the building.
Wow.
And this is the future of warfare. It's not more and more indiscriminate. It's more discriminate. It's more proportional, it's more precise, and I think you get to the point where you don't have to have 500,000 people, including tens of thousands of civilians, die in war. You can prosecute the war in the way that is the most moral and preserves life to the extent possible. And obviously, as I said before, the ultimate goal is to have such an advantage against any potential adversary that deterrence takes over, and no one would do it. No one would engage in conflict because they know that the cost of engaging in conflict is too high.
Yeah. So we jumped into Anduril, but how did you get there? What did young Trey imagine Trey would end up doing? You were in high school, let's say.
Man, I mean, when I was really young, I wanted to be a paleontologist, which is not connected to this story at all. But in high school, I really wanted to be a journalist, actually, which is pretty funny in retrospect, given what I think of mainstream media today. But yeah, I was the editor of my school newspaper. I was really interested in doing like kind of international correspondence work. So going and living abroad, reporting on geopolitical stuff. That was really what I was interested in. But then senior year of high school, September 11th, happened. And I think I went from this place where I thought doing geopolitical journalism was interesting to thinking I should probably be doing something in service to the country. I don't know what that is. Maybe it's going to the Air Force Academy, trying to be a fighter pilot. But I ended up going down the path of pursuing a career in national security in the intelligence community. That was the goal. So I went to Georgetown School of Foreign Service, studied Arabic, did security studies program, and ended up going into the intelligence community. And I think I expected that it was going to be something like James Bond. Like I was going to show up and I would have like these crazy supercomputers and they give me the keys to an Aston Martin and I would be like an international man of mystery. And that wasn't the case. I had a CRT monitor. I would run searches that I would call coffee break searches, where you like run the search, you start the search and then you leave and go get coffee because it just takes forever to get any results back. And I think it was at that moment that I realized that we weren't nearly as good at this as, the media and entertainment space would have you believe that we were. And that was kind of the beginning of me exploring this path in my career towards, working more directly to serve new technology, new capabilities to the people that we, the American people, are asking to put themselves in danger to protect us. And we're doing it with oftentimes, 70 plus year old technology.
Yeah.
Right.
So you joined Palantir as a software engineer, was it?
Well, yeah, that's right.
I was a forward deployed engineer.
Okay. What does that mean?
Well, at Palantir, it meant a lot of things. It meant my job changed every 6 months for 6 years.
Wow.
But it became very clear that my technical skills were nowhere near the level of the best engineers at the company. And I was more extroverted than most other people at the company. And therefore, I was responsible for sales.
Okay.
So in the Palantir world, forward deployed engineering meant that I was working with customers on the client side.
Gotcha.
So unlike the engineers that were sitting in Palo Alto, sleeping in cardboard boxes under their desks and eating pizza every meal, I was out in Washington, D.C., in government facilities, doing data integration, training people on how to use the product, getting feedback on what was working, what wasn't, and trying to build a system for each of these independent agencies that would help them accomplish their mission. So still very mission motivated, just doing it from the private sector side.
Gotcha. So it was kind of like a product, customer service, sales.
Yeah, everything
all
wrapped
rolled
into one.
Yeah.
Palantir had in the forward deployed engineering team, there were different teams that kind of carried different weights related to deployments. There were some that were like highly technical that were doing a lot of the engineering work on the client site. And then there were people that were more like project managers. And then there were people that were more like sales growth type engineers. And I straddled all three of those at various times during my 6 years at Palantir.
What were some big takeaways from 6 years at Palantir? I mean, 6 years at Palantir is you're starting at one company and then you're leaving. By the time you leave, I imagine it's a completely different beast.
Oh yeah, no, I joined and there were, not that many people there, like double-digit people at the company. And when I left, we had probably close to 1,500, 2,000 people.
Incredible.
Started with more or less $0 of revenue, ended with close to $1 billion. So yeah, things really changed a lot in the 6 years that I was there. Startups are awesome. I've been part of startups that have grown really fast. I've been part of startups that have grown really slow. I've been part of startups that had an incredible leadership team that knew exactly what to do from day one, and some that didn't. And I think the Palantir story, the thing that made it so powerful, and I think the reason that you've seen so many great companies come out of Palantir is that it wasn't easy. It was always a battle. We didn't really know how to sell to the government. We didn't really know why you shouldn't hire retired generals and why you shouldn't hire a bunch of consultants to help introduce you to people, why you shouldn't subcontract to the big defense companies. And we had to learn all that stuff the hard way. And I think as a result, you had like all of these mini startups running throughout the company, where people were given a tremendous amount of responsibility and accountability at a very early stage in their career. And I think it's super powerful when you get a bunch of people together that are all kind of focused on trying to figure this stuff out together.
So Palantir, would you say it was on the side of, here's the play, we're going to run it, we know exactly where we're headed, this is the plan. Other side being, we're going to just iterate our way. We don't know really where we're headed, but we're going to just...
No, I think Palantir was the latter, not the former.
Yeah.
It was like we didn't know what we were doing.
Yeah.
The average age of the company was like my age. So I joined when I was, I think, 25. And every year that I was there, it was like the average age was just tracking my age. So it was very young. And, most of the people there, it was their second job. So they like went and worked for, the government or went and worked for a consulting firm or whatever and hated it. And that's why they were at Palantir.
Got it.
And I think that led to them being really motivated, really high achieving, high potential people, but also without the experience that we really would have needed to like rapid accelerate in the way that like say Anduril has, because we already had that experience.
Gotcha.
It just made things a lot easier.
When you started, when it came back down to starting Anduril, were there things you saw at Palantir that made you bullish on the opportunity and the bet that you were making with Anduril? In other words, Palantir, covers a lot of ground, but maybe there's a little segment here or there that you guys could own and operate real quick.
Well, the biggest one is hardware versus software.
Right.
I think really glad that we did what we did at Palantir. I think it blazed a trail that not only Anduril, but a lot of other companies have been able to follow. It was painful, but we kind of learned all the lessons and set the precedence that was required to start the flywheel moving around innovation in defense. But, I think the Anduril version of this was just being able to stand on the shoulders of giants. It was, I don't think it would have been nearly as easy to do this before Palantir and SpaceX had happened than it was after. And the kind of the critical piece that we thought was kind of really too hard at Palantir was selling software. It turns out that the government doesn't know how to account for that. They don't know how to value it. They have like almost like a moral aversion to the idea of paying for something that has high margins. And so they end up building a lot of things from scratch that they should really be buying from, as commercial items, because they're like, your, cost to distribute this is like effectively zero. Like,
Right.
Why should we be paying you $10 million for something that like you can just, download off the internet? And so with Anduril, we took the opposite approach, which was to say the software is the thing that's driving a great deal of the value, but it's being Trojan horsed in the front door. Like we're selling you a thing that you can say like, there's a bill of materials. I know how much it costs to put together these pieces of metal and whatever. And the software rides in alongside of that. So they get the value, they get the thing that's really important to them, but they can also account better for the purchase, which makes things a lot easier.
Feels more tangible.
Yeah,
Right.
that makes sense. Yeah, my father was an engineer on the F-22 fighter planes. He spent 20 years of his career just on the F-22.
Great plane, by the way.
Amazing plane, the best. But you can see how that's like, from a U.S. government perspective, you're like, are we going to spend X millions, billions on this sweet plane or on a floppy disk, like software? It's just a different story.
Totally. The F-22 is actually a really good example of this. So if you were a aerospace engineer during the Cold War, you would work on dozens of aircraft in your career. Like look at the people like Skunk Works. Like they built the U-2, the SR-71. They have like this crazy lineage of like all these different platforms that they built They delivered rapidly, ahead of schedule for very low dollar amounts. And that's just not the way we do things today. This is 2024 is the 30th anniversary of the Joint Strike Fighter program of the F-35. 30 years. Like, this isn't something that just happened a few years ago. It's like, you know, it's only recently become operational, and we've been working on it for 30 years. This pace is painful. And I don't put that entirely on the big defense companies either. Like, there's an incentive structure that they've been given by the United States government. Like, it's requirements-driven, cost-plus contracting.
Right.
You know, the F-35 is being built in 400 congressional districts for a reason, because everybody has to get their piece of the pie. Everyone has to get jobs in their district. I just don't think that this is sustainable for the conflicts of the future. Like, we're fighting a battle that just doesn't make any sense anymore.
Yeah, that makes sense. And organizations age. Like, talking with my dad, it's like Boeing was one company in 1980. Like, lots of energy, lots of Cold War energy, to the time when he left in 2020, 40 years later, it's just a completely different atmosphere, pace, the entire thing.
Totally. And you can kind of see the big contract awards that are going to the defense primes as like, imagine like Adam Silver, the commissioner of the NBA, like handing a trophy to the 2024 Chicago Bulls and saying like, congratulations for the 1995 accomplishments in Michael Jordan. It's like, guys, that was 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Like, Michael Jordan hasn't been in the league for a long time. The 2024 Bulls, they suck.
Yeah.
Michael Jordan is not on this team. But we do this all the time. It's like, Lockheed Martin, we're rewarding you for Kelly Johnson and Skunk Works. It's like, Kelly Johnson's dead.
Yeah.
You can't give Kelly Johnson a contract anymore. He's not alive.
Yeah.
And we're kind of stuck in this mentality of, you know, rewarding past performance rather than potential for future development. And that puts us in a really difficult position for delivering the capabilities that our warfighters need.
So when did you go from just startups to startups and investing, joining Founders Fund, that whole side of things?
Well, you know, Peter Thiel, who's the CEO of Founders Fund and the, you know, founder of PayPal, he also was one of the co-founders of Palantir. And so in my role running sales at Palantir, I interacted with him pretty frequently. And in 2013, he asked me to come to Founders Fund. Now, obviously, I knew nothing about venture investing. My entire background is like government service and I guess at that point, software startups, but didn't know anything about investing, had no interest in finance. I've never taken a finance class in my life. I have no idea what I'm doing. And so I was a little confused when he asked me to come here. But, you know, I trusted him, also was pretty tired of the startup grind at that point. And so jumped here in January of 2014 to Founders Fund. And man, it's just like a very different thing than building a company. Learned a ton. In the first year, I did 500 pitch meetings, which is a lot of pitch meetings by any objective standard. And yeah, I just have been, in the 10 years that I've been here, still kind of like honing that model of how you think about investing, how you make the economics of a fund of our size work. And there's a lot that goes into it.
What do you think he saw, like attributes where he's like, Trey, like you should come, you should come and join Founders Fund?
You should ask Peter. Man, I think that investing is, you have to like have a science fiction mentality. Like you have to be able to think about the future. I think that's one aspect of it. And so I think a lot of the best investors that I know are people who spend a lot of their time thinking about like how do I invest in things and people that are going to like create a utopian version of the future rather than a dystopian version of the future. So I think that's one thing. Another thing is like an interest in people. Companies aren't built by nameless, faceless drones. They're built by physical human beings. And I think the reason we're called Founders Fund is that we invest in founders. We're not investing in ideas necessarily. And so I think having that relationship with Peter, him understanding that like I appreciated what great people had the ability to do. And I was lucky to work with some of those great people at Palantir. And the company wouldn't have worked had it not been for Dr. Karp, had it not been for Sham, had it not been for Stefan. You really, really needed this like greatness and expansiveness of ambition to make it work. And then I think the last piece, and this is like the thing that people are constantly talking about with Peter in particular, is like the contrarian nature. Like, I was never the type of person that sought to fit in. I had a lot of ideas that people thought were ridiculous and potentially offensive. I don't know. And I think that's part of what makes investors great investors as well, is the ability to believe things and to say things that are deeply unpopular, because the popular stuff is overcompeted. Everyone is running towards the same thing, fighting over the same capital, and you can maybe get involved in some big companies, but it'll be too late, the prices will be too high, and you're not actually going to be the S&P 500. So, I think that's a big driver for Peter's thesis in investing.
Yeah.
Anyone who's read 0 to 1 would understand pretty clearly.
Yeah, makes sense. Do you think, so you mentioned there are two very different things, the startup grind versus VC. Do you think like there are a lot of people who are may like have a good skill set to just be capital allocators their whole career, or is there always, Founders Fund is always focused on founders, and a lot of the people who are VCs here have been founders. How important do you think it is to have worked and founded startups before going into VC versus just going straight?
There's probably a lot of different arguments that you can make in both directions. I'm not smart enough as like a finance person to add really any value to our portfolio companies from that side of the equation, from being like a finance person. And
like look at the matrix and the code and then
I'm not going to do that. I'm not technical enough to advise them on how to build products. So I think like the operational muscle of having lived and breathed inside of these environments, like figured out how to do software scaling, that's really the edge that I try to bring into my investing. And you need some sort of edge to win deals, and everyone has different edges. There are people here who have not even worked at a startup. They've just been in investing their whole career, and they're quite good at what they do. And they're coming at it from a different perspective than I am. So I think there's something to, especially with earlier stage ventures, having this experience, because that's usually what the founders want. They want to know, like, what are the things that I should be avoiding? How can I build this company as efficiently as possible? How can I scale recruiting? How can I, scale growth? And so usually I think what you find is the earlier stage venture investors tend to perform better when they have some experience operationally.
No, at least it seems like founders also just appreciate that experience better than just working with.
I think it's less true.
It's
less true at growth.
Right.
Once you get to growth, I think they start thinking through like, what do I have to do to prepare for an IPO?
Right.
And that's like a different set of experiences.
Yeah.
Versus I just want to survive. Like build something great.
Yeah. Well, how much of the early stage is just knowing what it feels like, what a good startup feels like? You're like, whether you're throwing the pitch or swinging the bat, you're like, oh, that's it. Like this is what a good process is.
Yeah. I mean, it's like strangely intuitive more than anything else.
Yeah.
It's like, I think everyone wants to know, like, what is the rubric that you apply to investing. It's like, man, if I could tell you that, like, this job would be a lot easier than this. But there is no rubric. Every business has some idiosyncratic thing to it that you have to figure out. And I think developing a solid intuition requires a lot of reps, which, going back to my earlier point, is why I did 500 pitch meetings in my first year.
Yes.
Because without a lot of reps, it's very, very difficult to identify good from bad. But once you have all those reps under your belt, it's actually like you can make these decisions very quickly. You meet with a company, you're like, maybe the idea is good, maybe the founder's okay, maybe the market seems to make sense, but it just doesn't set off the alarm bells in your head, and it's like, nope, it's not the right one.
Yeah.
You just have to keep it going. And I don't think there are a whole lot of examples in the history of Founders Fund, even before I came here, where we met with a company that ended up being outstanding that we passed on. Like that doesn't actually happen that much. Like I think usually if you miss things, it's you miss it because you never saw it.
Right. It wasn't worth the look or necessarily.
Right.
Yeah.
Or you didn't think that
You
it
didn't
was.
think-
It
you didn't
obviously
think it
was. It ended up being awesome. Yeah.
For sure. So Trey, you were you're a Christian. You've been one of the sort of public Christians in Silicon Valley for a while, certainly longer than it post Vibe Shift is popular, less popular. How has that experience been like?
Totally fine, actually. I think like a lot of people who are believers in this community feel kind of under siege, and they're, you know, they want to keep it to themselves and not create any friction. And I think the thing that I love most about this community is that people are almost by definition curious. If you weren't a curious person, it would be kind of stupid to drop into the tech community and like work too hard and care too much. It's like you kind of have to be a curious person. And because of that, I found that, you know, people might be confused, but they want to understand why. And it just opens up opportunities for me to talk about my faith, because I think when people find out that I'm a Christian, they're like, well, you're obviously not stupid. So how did you get here? How do you justify
Connect
this?
those two things for me.
Yeah, exactly. And so I've never really found it to be uncomfortable or awkward. It's like everyone knows I'm a Christian. People still like me. I don't know. It
Castigated.
No, it really hasn't affected me at all.
Yeah, you had that post. You wrote that. It was an interesting essay where you connected sort of the mechanisms, the biblical mechanisms of forgiveness with startups. Do you find that is that one example of many where you apply sort of theological principles and mechanisms to both startups and investing?
Oh, there are all sorts of things. And, you know, I think going back to, you know, Peter's influence, not only on Founder Summit, but also on me personally, 0 to 1 is kind of a theology book. It's not just this philosophy of investing. It's actually all tied back to Rene Girard, who is a philosopher, a theologian at Stanford that Peter studied under. And, you know, I think so many of these lessons that we can learn from studying theology, not for what it's worth, not just like, you know, mainstream Protestant theology. I mean, I think you can go as broad as you want. There's a lot of lessons that can be learned from that impact, you know, the types of companies that a person might build, the way that you build a company, and the way that as investors we should be thinking about, you know, deploying capital. And so I think, you know, we live in a uniquely, you know, Western Christian philosophical tradition, whether or not people share the faith. And I think a lot of the reasons why, you know, the Western philosophical theological system has been so effective and efficient economically is because of the unique Christian characteristics of that culture. And that definitely is something that I think about all the time when I meet with companies.
Yeah. There was a post recently, last couple of months, somebody tweeted like, basically that without the Christian foundations of the West, it's going to be hard to maintain all of what we like about the West. And Musk responded and said something like, I think you were right. But I think, that's a lot of people are sort of realizing that, again, whether they share the faith or not, there's a lot of that of what made the West comes directly from a Christian sort of tradition.
Yeah, I mean, that's in a venture context. That's why Max Weber wrote The Protestant Ethic. Like, the largest companies of all time have been built by Christians historically. If you go back hundreds of years, like Dutch East India Company, largest of all time, same thing. So,
well, I think specifically what Max Weber was saying was it was Protestants.
Right. Yes. Exactly. Yes.
Not just Christians.
Exactly. No. Exactly. That's very true.
But yes, I think there are a lot of really unique attributes, and going to the forgiveness post that I wrote, this is something that I see all the time in Silicon Valley. Like if you look at business failure in China, for example. Literally, there are videos online of like grown men and women on their hands and knees crawling around like convention centers, reciting like, you know, failure mantras about not hitting their numbers for the quarter and things like that. It's like this kind of culture built on shame. And I think there's something really unique in Silicon Valley with this idea that like, it's actually totally fine if your company doesn't work. Like people are going to say like, what did you learn from that? How is that going to impact the next company that you start or the next thing that you do? And I think this is at its core, it's rooted in forgiveness, in this idea that like risk is good. And like, you know, we are given skills, we're given giftings, and it is our duty to participate in contributing and building towards the kingdom. And sometimes it's going to work, sometimes it's not going to work. But that's like actually totally fine.
Right. Yeah. And there's that Protestant aspect of building a company can be a good vocation. Like that can be a godly vocation. You don't have to be in the church to be
totally. Yeah. I mean, we are in that we are created in God's image. What is one of the core attributes of God? He's a creator. He creates things. And so we are co-creating with God in his own image. And I think, you know, there's a ton of incredible theological writing on this. Luther talked about it in great detail, that, you know, being a lay person doesn't mean that you're not participating in God's kingdom. Our vocations, regardless of what our vocations are, you know, he talks about even the milkmaid. Like think of the trickle-down impacts of someone providing milk to a community. We all have a role to play, and none of the roles are more significant or more noble or more just than any other. Of course, you know, Luther goes on to say all sorts of other things are not good vocations, one of which, by the way, he talks about soldiers in kind of this very weird way, which is directly applies to what I think of as my own core vocation. But yeah, I think we are all called, and our vocation is sacred in the same way that a priestly vocation is sacred. And I think that really contributes to what happens in entrepreneurship when you start thinking about it in that way. And I think obviously it's like overwrought to the point of being caricatured, and HBO's Silicon Valley, that's like, we're making the world a better place thing. I certainly don't think that like every company is making the world a better place. There are a lot of companies that are not making the world a better place. But I do think that like we should challenge ourselves to find that the sacred nature of our vocation and live our work in a way that is honoring to our Creator.
That's what I love about the space, the industry, both the building and the investing side, is there's a group of people that have a positive vision, ideally a better vision than what it currently exists about the future, and they're willing to will it into existence. You know,
the biggest challenge with this I've found, and this is something I've talked about publicly quite a bit. I wrote this essay called "Choosing Good Quests" with Marky Wagner, who is a Thiel Fellow, and like the human psychology is incredible. Like we have the ability to convince ourselves of anything that we want. And so after I wrote the Choosing Good Quests essay with Marky, both of us would have people come up to us and be like, let me tell you about this company that I'm building, the quest that I'm on. And they would tell us, and it would be like, that is pathetic. Like the thing that you're working on is not even remotely a good quest. But I think people have the ability to like tell themselves a story. And so I've found that it's actually more useful to do it in the opposite. It's like when you do something, you should not be convincing yourself that it's a good quest. You should be asking yourself, how is it not? How is the thing that I'm doing not a good quest? And if it's really easy to come up with answers to that question, like, I don't know, maybe you should think about your quest. Maybe that's not the right quest to be working on. I have done this in great detail with the things that I'm working on. Like we could spend this whole podcast talking about all the ways in which I think Anduril might not be a good quest. Now I've like reconciled all of those thoughts, and I think I have. I've been intellectually honest with myself about it. But man, there's like all sorts of reasons that I would understand that someone could poke on that and say, I think you're missing something. And we should all be doing that. We should all be forcing ourselves to ask ourselves hard questions about what we're doing and what the sacred nature of that vocation is.
Yeah.
Do you personally think about, like, this is my quest right now, like the Anduril quest? You have multiple that you're running at the same time. Like, when you're running that matrix for your own work, how does that go?
Yeah, I mean, there are like main quests and then there are side quests.
Yeah, yeah.
And there are all sorts of like bad ways you can do main quests
Yeah.
and side quests as well. Right. But like my main quest is national security. Like, how can I drive through my work better outcomes that reduce the unnecessary loss of life, that protect human dignity, and that lead to a world that is more peaceful than if I would not be engaged. And obviously, like, that's thinking a lot of myself. Like, that's a tall tale, and I would not go around telling people, like, you know,
Right.
I am the reason, Anduril is the reason why. But I think in the back of my head, I know, like, no, there's a reason we're doing this. And like, if we're not actually contributing to deterrence, if we're not actually contributing to a more just prosecution of conflict, then like, I shouldn't be doing this. I'd be wasting my time. And so like at some level, I have to believe that that's true. So I think that's my main quest. And that's something that has been on my heart since I was a teenager. And I've carried it with me through all of the different things that I've done in my career. Side quests, you know, you can have just side quests as well. And that could be they could look all sorts of different ways. Like, you know, right now it looks like starting a defense company. Right now it looks like starting a wearable e-reader company, because I care about digital hygiene and I want people to not be drawn into addiction around things that are destructive to our ability to think independently and things like that. At some later point, it might be serving in civil service, like going back and working for the government, being in a politically appointed role. It could, you know, look like being a venture capitalist. You know, there's a lot of different ways that can be drawn out. And I think the primary thing, again, is thinking about like not the positive version of this, but the negative version. Like, how is this thing that I'm doing not contributing to that quest?
Yeah. Can you talk about the Soul Reader? Something you just touched on it. I think the first time I heard about it, you told me about it. I was like,
Steinman told us about it.
okay. I was like, that sounds like something someone in Silicon Valley would come up with. I didn't know it was you, but it's just like in a negative way. I was like, why do we need that? But digital hygiene.
Yeah. So, you know, our usage of technology has been perverted in ways that I think are really destructive to humanity. And, you know, we could talk about TikTok and how
I'm sure you love TikTok.
adversary control of, you know, our communications technologies is probably bad. But let's lay aside the national security piece of this and just talk about, like, you know, the social media landscape. We traded off all of these single-purpose devices that were postulated in the Jetsons, for example, for a supercomputer in our pocket. And everything points back to the supercomputer in your pocket. And so all new technology is basically just like a window through the iPhone. And that means that our screen time has gone way up. It means that we're less engaged with humanity than we were before. I don't know if you've seen like the picture of LeBron James breaking the scoring record.
Yes.
And it's like every single person except one dude in the picture had their phone up.
Right.
And then the Michael Jordan hitting the game-winning shot in the NBA Finals, everyone was just cheering. They were just looking at him. It's like our whole engagement with humanity has shifted. And the impact of social media has been even more pronounced than I think we could have guessed 20 years ago. You have like mental health, rates of mental illness way off the charts, rates of suicide way off the charts. And, you know, we have to ask ourselves what we're doing. Like, why are we putting our children in a position where the only way that they feel like they can participate in their community is to do it in a way that increases loneliness and mental illness and the potential for them to hurt themselves?
There was that amazing study 2 weeks ago or so, I think it was, maybe 3 weeks ago, recently, where it showed that most high schoolers would be willing to pay. None of them really want to be on TikTok or these apps. In fact, most of them would be willing to pay money to have everybody in their peer group delete the apps.
But everyone would have to do it together.
But everyone would have to do
Yeah.
it together. So the only
Interesting.
reason they're on these apps to begin with, even though they don't want to be, is because everybody else is there.
Social gravity
It's
well.
the most, it's the most like mimetic sort of like, pull of these apps. No one really wants to be there, but if you're not there, you are the only one missing out. Anyway.
Right. Yeah, no, you're exactly right. I think you can see this play out in other parts of society as well, like dating apps are another great example. For millennia, we paired off in local community.
Yeah.
It's like you meet people at your church or at your school or wherever. And there are like social connections, bonds. It's like people know the person that you're
Right.
dating, they
Yeah,
know your family,
exactly.
you've been around each other for a while. And, marriage rates have been like fairly consistent, where, maybe the jock and the cheerleader get married, but like the funny guy can still get a girl and the, charming, smart girl can still get a guy. Everything kind of like works, or has worked historically. Obviously, I'm not like setting aside all of the terrible things that happen with, a deeply patriarchal society and women being subjected to, roles that maybe they weren't comfortable in. Like there are benefits to growth and progress in society, of course. But today, if you look at the impact of the dating apps, you get about the same number of you get about the same rates of together
Pairing, right? Yeah.
But it's massively offset where like it's kind of like an Adonis complex where like there are certain men that have a lot of sexual partners and then an increasing amount of men that have none. And the result of that is kind of this incel phenomenon where you have all these people who, because you're not winning based on your kindness, your generosity, your charm, your humor, there are people who are excluded on the basis of their height or their ability to sell themselves in pictures on social media. And there's nothing that's more destructive and destabilizing in a society than bored, lonely men, the young men. Right. That is like the catalyst for social contagion.
Yeah.
And that's what we're doing. We've created this world in which you're not relying on those local connections anymore. Now you're going to like a more of a local maximum for everyone in a specific geography. There's no connectivity between people. You don't know who these people are other than just like the profile that they're able to build on a dating site. And I think that's really bad for society. Anyway, so this circles back to the soul thing, is that the majority of pages read are not being read on e-readers. They're being read on iPhones because that's what people have in their pocket. Imagine how horrible and distracting this is. It's like you've got this full color screen that's blaring back to you. You got notifications popping up. And I think the result of that is that we're reading less long form content. We're reading less complicated content, and we're just being drawn into social media. You're being drawn into short form little blurbs, and these blurbs are, they create like a polarizing team mentality where it's like, I'm just responding to my tribe. My tribe is self-reinforcing. It continues to tell me that I have to believe everything that my tribe believes. There's no complexity in that understanding. It's just, I'm just feeding the beast constantly. And so the idea behind the Soul Reader is that it's solely a reader. You put them on, there's no notifications popping up. You're not being tempted to open your Instagram feed. You just have words in front of you and a pair of sunglasses.
And you can take it with you like you would a phone.
Well, you can take it with you like a sunglass, a pair of sunglasses in a sunglass case.
Yeah.
And what's different, I haven't tried it yet, but what I imagine just from looking at the site and talking to some people who've used it is, unlike a Kindle, the Kindle mentally, heuristically still feels kind of like an iPhone, like a tablet, right? And you can, the broader world is around it, so you can put it down and like see your phone vibrate over there, whatever. With the Soul Reader, it's like
You're in the world.
The movie theater experience, right? Like
you're immersed.
Everything's blocked.
That's right.
So unless your Apple Watch buzzes and maybe you're like, oh, okay, I got a notification, you should know that there's stuff happening around you should just be reading.
Right, and there's all sorts of other benefits to this. It's like when you're holding a Kindle, you still have to hold it in a position that's comfortable for holding a book. Like whether you're sitting up or you're laying in bed with your hands over your head, whatever it is. With the Soul Reader, you're just laying comfortably in whatever position. Like I'm a side sleeper. I lay on my side with the Soul Reader on. It's very comfortable. And I read until I'm tired enough to fall asleep. And then I take it off, put it on the nightstand, and go to bed.
That sounds
Strong.
So it's more comfortable. I can totally understand your response. In fact, like when I first started talking with people about this, including my co-founder, who's the CEO of the company, the initial response is like, "Why do you need that? That's kind of dumb." But then once you read with it, it like changes something almost biologically about your experience, and you read more. You're more excited to read. You're less distracted when you read. And you can see your screen time like fall off the cliff. My screen time has gone down significantly since I started using the Soul Reader, and I think that's like a common kind of like outcome.
And that's an interesting framing, especially like with the Good Quest mentality of accessibility drives so much. So if I've got a phone in my pocket, I'm however much more likely to be on garbage content versus if I have really good accessibility to long form reading, then that's great.
Yeah, I think like one of the kind of high level philosophical goals that I have for not only the specific product of the Soul Reader, but also like that kind of side quest in my mind is that I want people to think independently. And I think that means that you're going to break party lines on occasion. The politicians that I like the most are the ones who break party line, that are willing to say uncomfortable truths. The problem is in the American political system, obviously, breaking party lines is damaging from an electoral perspective. It makes it harder to get funding from the party. It makes it harder to win elections. But I'm not sure that the answer to that is doubling down and just saying like, well, that's the way the system is.
Stay within the line.
We just have to be super tribal, otherwise we can't win. It's like, I would like to believe that there's a possibility that in the future it will be accepted. In fact, look positively when someone says, you know what, no, I don't agree with the party line on this, and here's the reasoning I can offer for why I don't. That courage just basically never happens. And when it has happened in recent years, that person usually retires from Congress pretty quickly after they make those statements.
Yeah. So what? That was Soul Reader, one side quest. Pursuit, another side quest. What's the? How did you come up with the idea of Pursuit, and why do that one?
So I actually didn't come up with the idea for Pursuit. My two best friends from college kind of came together to build Pursuit. The idea behind that is that not that dissimilar from Soul, in fact, that connecting with the outdoors is important for our souls as people. And there are all of these ways in which private land access becomes either a great boom or a great impediment to our ability to do things like outdoor adventure activities. And so the initial idea for the company was to open up private land to people that wanted to participate in these activities, things like fishing or hunting, or, you can kind of take it from there. And more recently, that's come around to this idea of, could you do fractional ownership of like working ranch or sporting lands?
Yeah.
There's obviously like all of these fractional real estate companies that build they do like vacation homes, beach houses, things like that.
Yeah, you co-own a home and Telluride with like 7 other families.
Exactly, yeah. Like, some of these like really amazing properties in Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, super expensive, only really available to, the billionaire class. And I'm not saying that you're bringing the cost down by like, this isn't accessible to the mass market, but could you bring it down where you could do an 8-part split of a ranch like that, and figure out some way to make that the private land accessible through that fractional real estate transaction? I think there's a real opportunity there, and I think the owners, the real estate kind of community is really excited about this idea of, could you get more usage out of some of the best properties that are available by doing fractional ownership, by doing a marketplace concept.
Are there particular states that you guys are focusing on?
Right now it's mostly like, Western ranch type stuff. But I think there's potential obviously across the entire country.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's cool. A while back, 2 years ago, I was ready to go on a pursuit fly fishing thing, and then bad weather struck. It was going to be in Idaho. Bad weather struck, something like that, and the trip ended up getting canceled. And I was like so ready to go. Unfortunately, it didn't happen.
Yes, I was on the front leg of that trip, and then it started snowing.
That's right, you were there. That's right. And then I got the email. They were like, "Trey's been there. It's actually awful." The second half was getting canceled.
Yeah.
I was like, "Shoot."
It was rough. Yeah. It turns out that I think it was in late March or early April, and we just got a bad cold weather snap. So what are you gonna do?
Yeah. We were chatting earlier about, I think in one of your essays you talk about the PayPal mafia versus the short-lived Facebook mafia. That term isn't really used like the PayPal mafia is. How are those sort of good mafias created in terms of just like these groups of people that form and then end up going off and doing all these successful things?
Yeah, back to the point about Palantir. I think Palantir has a great mafia right now too. I think BizStone, the journalist, called it the Palantir Pack rather than the Palantir Mafia. So maybe I'll use her framing. But I think it goes back to how hard was it? Facebook was just always too easy. Google was always too easy. And so you don't get that scrappy mentality because people, they had their ball pits, they had their free lunches, they had their dogs at the office. Revenue was always up and to the right. And it doesn't really lead to scrappy entrepreneurs coming out. Whereas PayPal was multiple times, it was 12 hours away from total collapse. Right. Palantir, same thing. It took 5 years to get to 10 million in revenue. I mean, it was it wasn't always easy.
Yeah.
And I think there's something about that working really, really well.
Yeah.
This is part of my fear about the Anduril story as well, is that we haven't had that sort of really difficult drag on many things. There are areas in the company with some of the product lines and things like that where it's maybe been harder than others. But there's something about the resilience of having tough times that builds great founders.
Where do you expect the next mafia to come from? If you have any ideas, if you were a betting man, if you're not an investor, if you were a betting man.
Well, I mean, in the hard tech categories, you can kind of start seeing these emerging from the Palantirs, SpaceXs of the world.
Right.
I think there's a lot to experiencing failure in startups. There are all sorts of things you can learn from those experiences. But I think that there's also something really powerful about being part of a success story that had struggles. And so it's not that hard to identify those companies. You can just go look at the 20 highest valued privately traded tech companies and go through and say, which ones of these had a really hard run? Palantir and SpaceX are great examples of ones that had really hard runs. The ones in the social networking kind of digital communities space where they're generating advertising revenue, those are generally not good ones because when they work, the network effect just rips too fast.
Takes over, right?
It just takes over, and then it becomes less about execution and more about just controlling the growth.
Right.
The fusion reaction just kind of takes off on its
Exactly.
own. Just kind of manage it, right?
Yep.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what are you investing in here at Founders Fund? What areas do you?
We're generalists. We invest in everything. I think this goes back to this kind of core philosophical theological thing from Peter, which is that mimetic theory is very real. And if you focus on categories, that means that something had to have worked well enough for the thing to become a category. And if that's the case, then it's too late. You already missed it. If you're a space tech investor, but you didn't invest in SpaceX, you probably would have lost money. If you were a crypto investor, but you didn't invest in Bitcoin and Coinbase, you probably would have lost money. If you're a sharing economy, investor, but you didn't invest in Airbnb or Uber, you probably lost money. It's like you could do this with every category.
Right.
It turns out that like monopolies drive outcomes. And so at Founders, so we're generalists not because we don't have interest. We're generalists because we think that's the only way you can make money in venture. And so we just stay focused on founders. We just want to meet the best entrepreneurs in the world. And when we find someone that's really unique, really special, that's driving an outcome, we want to concentrate as much capital as we possibly can into those people.
Yeah.
Defense tech / hard tech feels like it's one of those categories that has been defined now. Like, and even the last 18 months has gotten dramatically more socially popular to be in hard tech or defense tech. Do you think that that is
Certainly unpopular to be in software now, at least.
Yeah, certainly,
popular, right.
certainly.
Well, not AI.
No.
Which is,
No, yeah, that is true.
Oh, yeah.
But do you see that as like a hotspot, a trend, the whole hard tech, defense tech thing, or do you think it's a new normal? in
It's
terms of
certainly
popularity?
becoming a trend. There will be good companies that come out of this boom, and I'm excited that people are more interested in this, certainly than when it was like totally anathema when I started Anduril in 2017. So in some ways it's good to see a network emerging around this. At the same time, I think people need to ask themselves hard questions. Like, why am I doing this? Am I doing this because I'm actually passionate about it, or just because it's easier to get validated by my peers because we're in this moment of hype? But that said, I think that the quests that this community of people in the hard tech and defense community, at least they're being motivated by a quest that I personally find to be more rewarding.
Yeah, no, certainly more tangible. But we were walking in downstairs, we saw Palmer Luckey on the cover of the newspaper, the Oppenheimer, modern Oppenheimer, whatever. It's like, oh, hey, that's more popular than it used to be. That's a difference.
Yeah, although I mean the headline might cause you to think otherwise, but I think that ended up being a pretty good story.
Yeah,
I was happy with how that came out.
So what do you think changed, particularly in Silicon Valley, where Anduril and companies like Anduril back in the day, not only did people not want to, they just thought it was unpopular, let's call it that way, to now there's, if anything, it feels like there's a strong hype around defense and hard tech. What changed? What's happening? Why are we here, not there anymore?
There are probably a lot of reasons. I think part of it is that people started experiencing the kind of like loneliness that comes from working on kind of soulless things. No matter how motivated people believe they are by money, I think there's something deep down inside of all of us that wants to care more than just about making money. So I think there's like that aspect of it. It probably plays into it. Part of this is also the conflict in Ukraine. I think it drew all sorts of people that thought that we had reached like a geopolitical end of history.
Yes.
And caused them to recognize that actually they're still bad actors. And if we don't stand up for people that are being unfairly attacked, literally attacked, kinetically, violently attacked, then who's going to? And we have some obligation as leaders in the world to do something about that. I think part of it is kind of the deterioration over the last 5 years of the woke mind virus, that I think people just became exhausted by this kind of idea that they were responsible in some way for saying the right words in the right order at the right times over and over again. It's like, actually, that just doesn't feel right. Like, it's something about this that just feels off. And I think that's made it much easier to say things that are true out loud. And that probably contributes to this as well. Some of it is probably politics. I think there was this broad belief across the entirety of tech that, like, when Trump left office, that defense budgets were going to go down and people weren't going to take it seriously anymore and the border was going to become less of an issue. And none of those things ended up being true.
Reverse.
Yeah, exactly.
No reverse.
And so I think that people that were saying, I'm opposed to this because of Donald Trump, are now looking at it and saying, like, I can't use that as an excuse anymore because the Democrats are saying the same things now. So it forces you to think a little bit more critically.
Right, beyond the party lines, like you were saying earlier.
Right, which doesn't happen enough, but when it does, I love to reward it. So good job to everyone that came around on these important issues.
Yes.
Makes sense. So as we wrap up here, you've been at Founders Fund for 10 years now?
Just over 10. Yeah.
Okay. Any lessons that stand out to you in retrospect, things where your mind has changed or your perspective has changed?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we've already covered several of these in the conversation. I think like the biggest thing for me that I've learned in my 10 years here is that there aren't that many companies that are generational that are going to have the ability to shift culture. Going back to your early point, I don't know, that might have even been before we started recording. Culture change is not driven by hundreds and hundreds of things pointing in the same direction. It's because one thing grabbed our imagination as a people and shifted us to thinking about something else. And those generational companies are in short supply. There's not many of them. In fact, over the 20-year history of Founders Fund, probably over 90, maybe 95% of all of our fund returns have come from no more than a dozen companies. And these companies are like have fundamentally changed the category that they're operating in, like Airbnb, Spotify, Stripe, Palantir, SpaceX, Facebook. Like, so I think sometimes venture investors go in and they have this idea that like, I'm going to invest in 100 companies. You know, maybe there's going to be like 10 or 20 that are, no, there's going to be one. If you're good, there's going to be one. And so I think I like went through the first probably like 7 or 8 years at Founders Fund thinking like, I'm just going to like shoot out a bunch of checks and like, maybe some of them end up being good. And if it's good, it like moves the needle enough to matter. And there have been good companies that I've invested in that way, but they haven't really moved the needle. You know, if I invest $5 million in a company and it 5X's, that's $25 million. We have $1 billion venture fund.
Oh,
like how many $25 million wins do I have to generate? And then you have like, you know, the Andurils of the world that will return the fund multiple times over. It's like those are the only ones that matter. We just have to make sure that we get into these generational movers. That's not the case for every fund, obviously. Like smaller funds that are doing seed investing or something. Like if you're like tens of millions of dollars in AUM rather than tens of billions of dollars in AUM, your incentive structure is a little different.
Right.
But for a founder, from a Founders Fund perspective, I think that's what I've learned is that we can't miss the generational ones.
Awesome.
Good deal. Trey, thanks for coming on. We appreciate you.
Bet.
Yeah,
thanks for having me. Take care, guys.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the New Founding Podcast. New Founding has become a rallying point for founders and investors who are taking serious bets in the face of a stagnant business culture. Our venture fund backs founders building dynamic companies, powered by American ideals and a positive national vision. These are the kinds of founders that embody the optimism and competence of the people who come on this podcast. If you're interested in investing in our fund, check out newfounding.com/venturefund and follow the link to apply.